reinterpreting those and rediscovering those and retelling those myths, because they actually do provide us with a template for a more sustainable future and give us a roadmap and role models to make the world a better place and help us become better human beings. And for me, this all came about sort of a perfect storm. I had started a nonprofit organization called the ISIS Ancient Culture Society. And my dearest friend, who was my right hand, said that, well, she, after years of being a goddess advocate, she was no longer going to be able to do it anymore because she didn't feel like it was actually helping us to empower ourselves to become better people. Where was the morality? Where was the ethics? The idea of the, you know, the golden rule, or the, you know, what you put out comes back to you. You know, that wasn't enough for her. It was all just too vague. The other thing was an interview I had with the late Margot Adler. We were lamenting where are the pagans on the front lines of social justice, whether it be for women or whether it be advocates for the earth, because after all, goddess spirituality is an earth-based spirituality. And finally, the third item in the perfect storm for me was the Dalai Lama, when he said it would be Western women who would save the world. I'll speak a little bit more about that in closing toward the end, but for me, I didn't think it was going to be Western women necessarily. I thought it would be sacred feminine values and ideals. And I think the next part of this for me, in talking about reawakening our sacred stories, you know, why do some pagans end up going in the social justice arena and some don't? And I think it really has to do with our teachers. Where do we learn this from? How do we come to it? And we come to it from so many different ways. We may come to it from art, we may come to it because it's in our family, or maybe we come to it because our teachers were Starhawk, or you know, maybe Ray Buckland or Selena Fox, or you know, many of these other teachers. But people like me actually came to it because of the feminist scholars. Rianne Eisler was a mentor of mine. She wrote Chalice and the Blade, and now she's talking about caring economies. Caring economies, I do believe, is a part of goddess spirituality when you reconcile the spirituality and the politics. And also Merlin Stone, who wrote the wonderful book, you know, When God Was a Woman. But, you know, when you discover goddess spirituality, there's so much to learn. You know, you can go into astrology, you can go into energetics, you know, how do you create altars, how do you create ritual? I mean, there's just so many things that are involved in goddess spirituality. You may never make it to the idea of social justice activism. And that's unfortunate, because you may never get to the point of understanding that our mythology shapes our culture. And when you understand that our mythology shapes our culture, then you understand how important these myths are. For instance, you know, there's a feminist scholar who says you can justify anything if you say that those are the words of God. Well, what I'd like to propose is, if that's the case, then why are we not using sacred feminine goddess theology to create a better world, the world that we would like to see?
Right.
So if we end up, you know, along the lines of mythology shapes our culture, what we're experiencing now is so many of our religions has a male war god as the primary myth. And that ends up in our violent patriarchal culture that we experience right now. And you know, it's filled with sexism, classism, homophobia, environmental exploitation, economic exploitation. I mean, take for instance just the Garden of Eden myth. Now, one of my mentors, Merlin Stone, believed that that was the first political propaganda story in the world. And when you think about it, that story still affects us today. And she believes that that political propaganda story of the Garden of Eden was to steer people away from goddess and goddess ideals and female leadership. So let's talk a little bit about goddess mythology, patriarchal goddess mythology versus pre-patriarchal goddess mythology. You know, if you're like me, the first goddess myths you heard were probably the Greek myths, and you heard about Hera, and I mean, who was Hera? Hera was this petulant wife chasing after her philandering husband, or there was Aphrodite, you know, she was just, you know, the boudoir babe,
right.
Or, you know, we have the Hindu goddesses, you know, with the exception of maybe Kali and Durga. Many of the feminist scholars say that unfortunately in patriarchy, the Hindu goddesses became spouseified or domesticated, and they're little more than a god's wife. So we can see that, you know, maybe the goddesses are shadows of their former selves under patriarchy. And who does patriarchy allow us as women to have as a role model? They allow us to have Mary, Jesus' mother. And beautiful and wonderful as she is, she's rather benign and passive. And sometimes I think we need more of that Sekhmet energy, that Durga energy, that Kali energy, because otherwise we end up with the inequality that so many women suffer from today. Because I think you can make a direct correlation between losing a feminine face of God and women today suffering all the ills of patriarchal society, whether it be female genital mutilation, domestic violence. In the United States, there's only 20% of female leadership in politics, academia, religious institutions. We still have men telling us what we can or can't do with our bodies, that sex is ugly, that abortion is a terrible thing. You know, can we have access to contraception in 2015? Some men on television are still saying we should put a pill between our knees and that would solve it. So I think we need new myths, we need new stories. And one example of a goddess myth that really needs to be rehabilitated is the myth of Demeter and Persephone. Now, Demeter and Persephone, probably the story most of you know, is the one where Hades comes along and abducts Persephone, takes her down into the underworld. Some people say it's about abduction and rape. And we believe that's the patriarchal story of Demeter and Persephone, and it, in a way, gives license to men to do horrible things. Now, there was an egalitarian story of Demeter and Persephone, but that's not the one we all know and hear about and talk about. And there was a pre-patriarchal story of Demeter and Persephone. And in the pre-patriarchal story of Demeter and Persephone, Hades doesn't even exist in the story. It's a story about a mother and a daughter. It's a story about good relationships between mothers and daughters, about a mother letting a daughter go off to lead the life she believed she was called to lead. In this case, Persephone believed that she should go down and be the caretaker of the people in the underworld. And of course, when she was down there, Demeter was sad, so we had winter, and when she returned to her mother, that was when we had spring. But you see, there was no rape, there was no abduction, because I can't believe that in a woman's culture where women are leaders, that they would condone that type of story of abduction and rape of women. So let's look at what goddess spirituality, what goddess mythology, what's out there that we can actually reclaim and use and reinterpret in the stories that we can tell to reshape our culture. Because if we want a new normal, we need new stories. And again, let me stress, if you don't believe that stories shape a culture, just keep thinking about the Garden of Eden myth, where the woman is the evil one and Lilith is is demonized because she dared want to be independent or equal or in partnership with Adam. And what happens to her in a patriarchal religion? She's deemed a demon, and then Eve, she wants knowledge. Well, that's a horrible thing, isn't it? And so from there forward, women are seen as the ones who caused the downfall of humanity. But if we really look at some of the goddess myths, and if we look at them from a pre-patriarchal point of view, there's so much there that we can mine. And I think the goddess Isis is the first one I'll mention. She's an incredible deity archetype, and her mythology offers us so many values. For instance, if you're familiar with Isis, you might have seen some of her images on temple walls, and she's standing there offering to the pharaoh a symbol of Ma'at. Well, Ma'at is a goddess, and Ma'at represents truth and justice. And it is Isis who is handing the pharaoh Ma'at. He serves at her pleasure. She is saying, yes, I will allow you to rule if you rule using the values of Ma'at, truth and justice. So if that was a story we taught our children, do you think we would be having these struggles today with gender imbalance? I don't think so. We would maybe either have an egalitarian society, or female leadership wouldn't even be something we questioned. Isis is also a wonderful role model for partnership. Her and her husband Osiris were thought to bring civilization to the world. They taught men and women to love one another. And she's also a wonderful role model for single mothers. Instead of single mothers having this shame attached to being a single mother, Isis was a single mother, so she's an archetype for single mothers. She's also an archetype for widows, because at a point in her life she was a widow. So would we allow widows to be so vulnerable in our culture if we looked at the Isis myth? I don't think so. We have other goddesses that we can look at their myths and glean important messages. Sedna is an Inuit goddess. Now, the Inuits are indigenous people from the icy waters of like Newfoundland or Alaska. And they rely on the creatures of the sea for their food. They use their skin, they use their blubber, they use their meat, they use their teeth. Now Sedna, the Inuit goddess, one of her stories is about how she is a gatekeeper between humankind and the creatures of the sea. And basically she sort of calls the shots. There is this reciprocity between human beings and the animals of the sea, and there's a balance that needs to be struck. Humankind can avail themselves of the creatures of the sea in order to survive, but they can't take more than they need. And that's the whole point. There's no exploitation of the natural resources. There's no abuse of the animals of the sea. Because if there is, Sedna as the gatekeeper cuts humanity off and says, if you can't do what's right, if you're going to be greedy, if you're going to exploit, you will have nothing. So imagine if that were the story that we grew up with. Greed and exploitation and imbalance, and this exploitation of our environment would just not be. It would be taboo. Now, there are people who have started this idea of reclaiming stories of the sacred feminine. And I think the people who have reclaimed, for instance, the Mary Magdalene stories, they are a good example of people who are rehabilitating and reframing and reinterpreting who Mary Magdalene was, what her relationship with Jesus might have been. And we look at that as a sacred partnership, the divine feminine and sacred masculine. Also, too, for those of us who maybe grew up with the idea of maid, mother, and crone, some of my colleagues, one of them is on the front row here, besides maid, mother, and crone as archetypes for women, we also now have women learning about the archetype of the queen. Because once a woman, you know, patriarchy's fine with the young, nubile, sexy maiden, or patriarchy's fine with the giving mother who gives and gives and gives and births babies and, you know, gives men, you know, children to carry on their legacy. And, you know, they're fine with old women, you know, elders who maybe they can relegate to the, into the shadows. But there's more to a woman's life than maid, mother, and crone.
Thank you.
You know, when a woman is finished being a mother, that's when she's really at her peak. That's really when she's at her most powerful.
Yes.
So we are reframing the idea of the queen, or some people even call it the empress, because she is the one who looks out for the people. She is the one who, you know, who is in service to her community and makes sure that her community and the people in it have what they need to have a good quality of life. So we have that archetype, the queen, also now entering into the equation. And, you know, if you feel a little bit uncomfortable about this idea of reinterpreting or reframing or retelling these old stories, I would say to you that mythology has always been shifting and changing. I already mentioned the Demeter myth had a pre-patriarchal version, there was an egalitarian version, and then there was a patriarchal version. And do we think for a minute that the people who wrote the Bible didn't have their own ideas and agenda about what they wanted those stories to say to humankind, how they were trying to steer humanity? Because when they decided the book of Thomas and the book of Mary weren't going to be in the Bible, that was a conscious decision that they made that would have totally you know, taking Christianity in a whole different direction. So, or imagine if the first printed and widely distributed book hadn't been the Bible. What if it had been the interpreted papyrus of Isis? Wouldn't that be interesting? But I guess what I'm saying to you is give yourselves permission to reinterpret these myths. Because if we want to see a new normal on this planet, then we need to change the stories. We have no choice. And we have so much good information there already that we can tap into. But we need to be the ones retelling the stories. And we have to give ourselves permission, I think, and feel comfortable to do these reinterpretations, these retellings. And I think it's also important that we reconcile our spirituality and our politics, because I said I'd come back to the idea of the Dalai Lama. Well, I love the Dalai Lama, and we were all very excited when he said it would be Western women who would save the world, because here was this male leader who was giving so much power to women. However, we know that there are some women out there who support the status quo, who think it's fine the way things are. You know, they embrace the institutions that exploit, and they embrace the institutions that oppress. So I don't think it's actually women who will save the world, because there are too many wonderful men who believe in caring and sharing and partnership and negotiation and peace. I believe it's actually sacred feminine liberation theology that will be the thing that changes the world, because sacred feminine liberation theology, I'd like to suggest to you, we goddess advocates believe, is strength and tenacity, but it's also caring and sharing and partnership and reciprocity. It's negotiation. And did I say partnership? I can't say partnership enough. If you leave my talk today with no other thought or remembering, remember that one of the things we try to promote the most is balance and partnership and peace. That's really what we're about. Because if we really did have balance and partnership and peace and justice, there wouldn't be an issue of equal pay. We wouldn't be measuring ourselves, I don't think, by our wealth. We would maybe be measuring the value of ourselves by how we are in service to the community, how we are in service to the world. What type of human beings are we? Are we about our personal development, or this? Are we going to continue this infinite growth on a planet with finite resources? So again, I just would like to stress that there is so much out there. The indigenous people were responsible for helping our founding fathers shape our Constitution, but that's not something you hear much about in our schools either. So, you know, we have to take responsibility for our own education. We have to be the teachers. We have to be the ones retelling these stories, rebirthing these ideas of the sacred feminine into the world. So with that, I will close, and I have 5 minutes before I have to turn it over to the next panelist. Are there any quick questions?
What is the best source you would recommend to get these new visions or improved visions of your myths?
Well, you can look up Merlin Stone as one, and you know, I would like to actually leave you with this quick little story, and I will tell you about this book as well. This sort of answers that question. There's a great little book out there. It's The Lost Goddesses of Early Greece by Charlene Spretnak. And this is a very short retelling of the myth of Pandora. Now, we know Pandora, you know, the patriarchal myth of Pandora is how she was this, you know, curious woman who opened up the box and unleashed all the evils and ills onto the world. But what if this had been the story we grew up with Pandora? Earth Mother had given the mortals life. This puzzled them greatly. They would stare curiously at one another, then turn away to forage for food. Slowly they found that hunger has many forms. One morning the humans followed an unusually plump bear cub to a hillside covered with bushes that hung heavy with red berries. They began to feast at once, hardly aware of the tremors beginning beneath their feet. As the quaking increased, a chasm gaped at the crest of the hill, and from it arose Pandora in her earthen pithos. The mortals were paralyzed with fear, but the goddess drew them into her aura. I am Pandora, giver of all gifts. She lifted the lid from the large jar. From it she took a pomegranate, which became an apple, which became a lemon, which became a pear. I bring you flowering trees that bear fruit, gnarled trees hung with olives, and this the grapevine that will sustain you. She reached into the jar for a handful of seeds and sprinkled them over the hillside. I bring you plants for hunger and illness, for weaving and dyeing. Hidden beneath my surface you'll find minerals, ore, and clay of endless form. She took from the jar 2 flat stones. Attend with care, my plainest gift, I bring you flint. Then Pandora turned the jar on its side, inundating the hillside with her flowing grace. The mortals were bathed in the changing colors of her aura. I bring you wonder, curiosity, memory. I bring you wisdom. I bring you justice with mercy. I bring you caring and communal bonds. I bring you courage, strength, endurance. I bring you loving kindness for all beings. I bring you the seeds of peace. So imagine the power of these type of stories. If these were the stories we told our children, would not the world be an incredibly different place? So please look to the sacred feminine for these rich stories so that we can create a new normal in the world. One last question. Well, I think that's up to us. We have to be the ones that set the agenda. She asked, how can we create Mary Magdalene from becoming spouseified? I think we have to be the ones telling the stories and not let that happen. I want to be respectful of my other panelists, so I'm going to have to turn it over. But please feel free to talk to me after the presentation. And you can come up and get some of these cards that will show you how to reach me. Thank you so much for being here today. Thank you so much for your open
Karen Tate. Woo! Thank you, Karen.
And above all, thank you for having an open mind. Blessed be.
Blessed be.